The drive from the lush, rain-soaked pines of Eugene, Oregon, to the sun-bleached concrete of Los Angeles took Sharon Cooper 14 hours. Her 2012 Subaru Outback, rattling slightly when it pushed past 65, felt like a foreign object as she finally turned onto the pristine, gated streets of Hidden Hills. Here, the lawns didn't just grow, they were manicured into submission. Sharon pulled up to her daughter's house, a sprawling, stark white, modern farmhouse that looked less like a home and more like a high-end rehabilitation clinic. There were no trees in the front yard, just perfectly symmetrical agave plants sitting in crushed white gravel. She parked her dusty Subaru behind a line of sleek black Range Rovers and silver Teslas, instantly aware of how her car looked like a stain on a perfect canvas. She took a deep breath, smoothing down her knitted cardigan. In her passenger seat sat a heavy, square cardboard box, carefully wrapped in brown craft paper and tied with a simple piece of twine. It wasn't wrapped in glossy metallic paper from a boutique, but what was inside held 45 years of memories. As she approached the massive custom oak front door, the muted, rhythmic thumping of deep house music vibrated through the wood. She didn't even need to knock. The door was ajar, spilling the golden artificial light of the foyer into the evening air. Stepping inside, Sharon was hit by a wall of sensory overload. The air smelled of expensive sandalwood room spray and truffle oil. The house was a temple of neutrality. Beige walls, cream-colored boucle sofas, matte black fixtures, and absolutely zero personal photographs. It was a space designed to be photographed, not lived in. "Mom, you made it!" Rebecca's voice cut through the low hum of networking chatter. Sharon's daughter, turning 35 today, looked flawless. She wore a silk champagne-colored slip dress, her hair blown out into loose, effortless waves that took hours to achieve. Rebecca hugged her, but it was a carefully calculated embrace. Shoulders touching, hips pulled back to avoid wrinkling the silk. She smelled like Baccarat Rouge and expensive champagne. "Happy birthday, sweetheart," Sharon smiled, holding the heavy box against her chest. The traffic on the I-5 was brutal, but I wouldn't miss it. "I'm so glad you're here. Put your coat anywhere. Actually, let me have Maria take it," Rebecca said, signaling to a woman in a crisp black uniform who silently spirited Sharon's cardigan away. Sharon suddenly felt incredibly exposed in her simple linen blouse. The living room was filled with Rebecca and Scott's inner circle. Real estate developers, tech executives, and people who communicated entirely in buzzwords like portfolio, synergy, and yield. The clinking of crystal flutes and the hollow, performative laughter echoed off the high, barren ceilings. Scott Walker, her son-in-law, materialized from the kitchen. He was holding a glass of scotch, wearing a navy blazer over a crisp white t-shirt. His smile was blinding, practiced, and didn't reach his eyes. "Sharon, surprised the old Subaru made it down the mountains," Scott said, patting her shoulder a little too hard. It was disguised as a joke, but the condescension dripped off every syllable. "She runs just fine, Scott," Sharon replied mildly. Out of the corner of her eye, Sharon spotted Brandon, her youngest. He was lingering near the extravagant charcuterie board, looking just as out of place in his faded denim jacket as she did. Brandon offered her a small, tight smile and raised his beer bottle in greeting, but he didn't cross the room. He hated confrontation, hated these parties, and mostly, he hated being reminded of how much more successful his sister appeared to be. An hour passed in agonizing slow motion. Sharon stood by the kitchen island, nursing a glass of sparkling water, watching her daughter work the room. Rebecca wasn't celebrating a birthday. She was hosting a networking event. Every smile, every laugh was an investment toward her next luxury real estate listing. When the crowd finally thinned out and the catering staff began clearing the plates, Sharon saw her window. It was just the family now, Rebecca, Scott, and Brandon, gathering in the kitchen. "I brought your present, Becky," Sharon said gently, using the childhood nickname her daughter now despised. "Oh, Mom, you didn't have to," Rebecca sighed, leaning against the cold marble of the kitchen island. Scott checked his Rolex, his jaw muscles flexing in a subtle show of impatience. Sharon placed the heavy brown paper package on the counter. "I've been waiting for a milestone birthday to give this to you. I bought it at a flea market in Brooklyn back in 1979. Before you were born, back when your father and I were just scraping by. It sat on my nightstand for 40 years. It always reminded me of grounding, of staying rooted when everything else is chaotic. Rebecca untied the twine. The paper fell away, revealing the object. It was a ceramic sculpture. It was asymmetrical, raw, and earthy. The clay was a deep mottled charcoal and rust, twisting into a brutalist organic shape that defied traditional description. It was heavy, primitive, and undeniably unique. The silence in the kitchen was deafening. It wasn't a silence of awe. It was a silence of profound, uncomfortable calculation. Brandon shifted his weight, looking at his boots. Rebecca stared at the piece, her manicured fingers hovering over it as if it were radioactive. The smile she plastered on her face was the exact same one she used earlier when a guest spilled wine on the patio. Wow, Mom, it's very earthy. It's certainly a conversation starter, Scott chimed in, leaning over the counter. He didn't bother to hide the sneer. Is it a vase? An ashtray? Looks like something a high school art class would fire up. Scott, Brandon muttered, his voice weak. Don't be a jerk. I'm just asking, man. Scott threw his hands up defensively. It's heavy as a brick. It's an abstract piece, Sharon said quietly, feeling a hot flush of humiliation creeping up her neck. I know it's not from a designer boutique, but it has a lot of history. Thank you, Mom. Really, Rebecca said, quickly pulling the wrapping paper back over the sculpture, hiding it from view as quickly as possible. I'll find a special place for it. Maybe in the garage gym or the back patio. It fits that rustic outdoor vibe. The back patio. The words felt like a physical slap. Of course. Wherever you think it fits, Sharon managed to say, her throat tightening. By 11 p.m., the house was finally quiet. Sharon had been assigned the guest suite on the first floor, a room so sterile it felt like a hotel. She lay awake in the dark, the Egyptian cotton sheets feeling cold against her skin. A persistent headache throbbed behind her eyes. She needed her Advil, which she had left in the glove compartment of her car. Sharon threw her cardigan over her shoulders and quietly slipped out the side door, stepping onto the impeccably paved driveway. The Los Angeles night air was cool, carrying the faint scent of jasmine. As she retrieved her medicine from the Subaru, a low voice drifted over the hedge from the direction of the open garage. It was Scott. I don't care what the penalty is. We need to push the closing date. If the bank runs another credit sweep right now, we are dead in the water, Marcus. Just stall them. Sharon froze behind her car. Scott sounded panicked, stripped of the arrogant veneer he'd worn all night. A moment later, the door connecting the house to the garage clicked open. Rebecca's footsteps echoed on the concrete. Did you deal with the caterers? Scott asked, his tone instantly shifting to a harsh whisper. They charged us an extra $2,000 for overtime. I put it on the Amex, Rebecca hissed back. Scott, we are maxed out. If the Henderson listing doesn't sell by the 15th, I don't know how we're making the mortgage next month. Sharon held her breath, pressing her back against the cold metal of her car. Maxed out? They lived in a $4 million house. They drove luxury cars. How could they be maxed out? We'll figure it out. We always do, Scott said dismissively. Then there was the heavy rustle of thick plastic. A trash bag. Can you hold this open? I'm clearing out the junk from the counter before the cleaners get here tomorrow. Careful with that heavy thing. Rebecca's voice rang out, clear and sharp in the quiet night. Sharon heard the distinct, heavy thud of her ceramic sculpture being dropped into a plastic garbage bag. What was your mother thinking? Scott scoffed, tying the bag with a violent yank. Bringing an actual piece of garbage to the house. The thing ruins the entire aesthetic of the living room. It looks like dried mud. She's delusional, Scott. She's always been delusional. Rebecca sighed, sounding exhausted. She lives in this fantasy world where thrift store junk has spiritual meaning. She just doesn't understand the kind of image we have to maintain. If my clients saw that hideous lump sitting in my house, they'd think we were going bankrupt. They wouldn't be entirely wrong, Sharon thought, a cold realization settling over her. I'm putting it in the Goodwill donation bin tomorrow, or maybe I'll just leave it on the curb, Scott muttered. Just get it out of my sight. God, I need a Xanax. The heavy garage door closed, plunging the driveway back into silence. Sharon stood there for a long time. She didn't cry. The pain in her chest was too deep, too hollow for tears. She thought about the little girl she used to take to art museums. She thought about the daughter she used to paint with on the kitchen floor. That girl was gone, replaced by a hollow shell of anxiety and brand names, married to a man who was drowning them both in debt just to look wealthy. Slowly, deliberately, Sharon walked over to the side of the garage where the trash bins were kept. She opened the lid of the black bin. Resting on top of empty champagne bottles and discarded catering trays was the heavy plastic bag. She untied it, reached her hands in, and pulled her ceramic sculpture out. It felt grounding against her palms. Solid. Real. The only real thing in this entire zip code. She walked back to its guest suite, packed her small duffel bag, and placed the sculpture gently into it. Then she took a piece of branded stationery from the nightstand and picked up a pen. Rebecca, I heard you and Scott in the garage. I'm sorry my gift burdened you and threatened the image you work so hard to project. I've taken the hideous lump back so you don't have to waste a trip to the curb. I hope the Henderson listing sells. Take care of yourself. Mom. She left the note perfectly centered on the kitchen island. By 2 a.m., the taillights of the old Subaru Outback were fading into the Los Angeles freeway, heading north, back to reality. 30 minutes into the drive, her phone buzzed on the dashboard. A text from Brandon. Hey, Mom, saw you left? Sorry about Scott tonight. He's just stressed with work. Drive safe. Sharon read the message at a red light. Brandon knew. He always knew, but he never stood up for her. He just smoothed things over, taking the path of least resistance. She locked her phone, tossed it into the passenger seat next to the sculpture, and drove into the dark. Tuyệt vời, chúng ta sẽ đi vào phần 2. Act 2. Vì phần này có rất nhiều diễn biến tâm lý phức tạp và các sự kiện lớn, từ việc khám phá ra bí mật đến phiên đấu giá căng thẳng. Tôi sẽ chia Act 2 làm 2 nửa để đảm bảo độ sâu của từng câu chữ. The rain in Eugene, Oregon, was relentless. It had been drumming against the windows of Sharon's modest 2-bedroom bungalow for 3 straight days since her return from Los Angeles. Sharon sat at her scratched Formica kitchen table, a mug of lukewarm Earl Grey tea pushed to the side. In front of her sat the ceramic sculpture. In the harsh daylight of her kitchen, stripped of the ambient lighting of Rebecca's mansion, the piece looked even more raw. It was bruised, earthy, and unabashedly imperfect. She poured a little warm water into a plastic bowl, added a drop of Dawn dish soap, and picked up an old, soft-bristled toothbrush. It was a soothing ritual. As she gently scrubbed the dust out of the deep twisting crevices of the clay, her mind kept replaying the sharp, metallic sound of the sculpture hitting the bottom of Scott's garbage bag. It looks like dried mud. Scott's voice echoed in her head. Sharon swallowed hard and turned the heavy piece upside down to wipe the base. That was when she stopped. Her thumb grazed a texture that wasn't a natural imperfection of the clay. She grabbed her reading glasses from the counter and leaned in close. There, pressed deep into the unglazed bottom of the sculpture, was a small, perfectly squared chop mark. A seal. It looked like an intricate geometric combination of 2 interlocking shapes. Sharon's heart skipped a strange, erratic beat. She had taught high school art for 30 years. She knew the difference between a student's clumsy initials and a master's signature seal. She took a clear macro photograph of the seal with her phone and emailed it to Arthur Pendleton, a former colleague who now worked as a senior curator at the Portland Art Museum. Her phone rang less than 20 minutes later. Sharon. Arthur's voice was breathless, entirely lacking his usual academic drawl. Where on earth did you get this? A flea market in Brooklyn, 1979. Paid $50 for it. Why, Arthur? What is it? There was a heavy pause on the line. She could hear the rustle of papers, the clicking of a keyboard. Sharon, I need you to wrap that piece in bubble wrap, put it in a box, and drive up to Portland right now. If I'm looking at what I think I'm looking at, you have an undocumented Yuki Nakamura. The name hit Sharon like a physical force. Yuki Nakamura, the Japanese-American sculptor whose brutalist, organic ceramic works from the late 60s and 70s had recently become the holy grail of modern art collectors. Nakamura had destroyed most of her early works in a fit of depression before passing away in the 90s. The surviving pieces were fiercely guarded in private collections. Arthur, that's impossible. It's just a piece I liked. It's been sitting on my nightstand collecting dust. Sharon, Arthur said, his tone dead serious. Do not leave it in your car. Do not stop for coffee. Bring it to my office. The verification process took 3 agonizing weeks. Sotheby's auction house in New York had flown a specialist out to Oregon. They used ultraviolet light, thermal imaging, and cross-referenced the chemical composition of the clay with Nakamura's known kiln sites in upstate New York. When the final authentication certificate was printed, the Sotheby's representative, a sharp woman in a tailored Celine suit named Eleanor, sat across from Sharon at the kitchen table. The sculpture was now resting in a custom-built, climate-controlled pelican case. "Mrs. Cooper," Eleanor said, folding her manicured hands. Nakamura's Earthly Bindings series was thought to consist of only 12 pieces. Yours is the 13th. It is pristine. The market for mid-century female artists of color is exploding right now. We want this for our contemporary art evening sale next month. What kind of estimate are we talking about?" Sharon asked, her voice barely above a whisper. She thought about Rebecca's maxed-out credit cards. She thought about Brandon's endless struggles to pay his rent. Conservatively? Elinor smiled a sharp professional smile. 800,000, but with the right bidding war in the room, it could easily break $1 million. Sharon felt the blood drain from her face. $1 million. The thing Rebecca had called a hideous lump. The thing Scott had tossed into a trash bag to make room for his catered hors d'oeuvres. The night of the auction, Sharon did not fly to New York. She couldn't stomach the thought of being in a room full of people who looked and sounded exactly like her son-in-law. Instead, she sat in her dark living room in Eugene, a knitted blanket over her lap, watching the Sotheby's private live stream on her iPad. The contrast was absurd. On her screen was a room dripping in wealth, men in bespoke tuxedos, women in designer gowns, banks of telephones manned by aggressive brokers in headsets. "Lot 42, the auctioneer, a tall, charismatic Brit, announced. The camera panned to the podium. There it was, her Brooklyn flea market find, rotating slowly under a halo of dramatic, perfect gallery lighting. It looked magnificent. It looked like history. An exceptional, recently rediscovered masterpiece by Yuki Nakamura, untitled, from the Earthly Bindings series. We opened the bidding at $600,000. Sharon stopped breathing. 600, thank you. Do I hear 650? 650 in the room. 700,000 to the lady in the front. The numbers climbed with terrifying speed. The auctioneer's rhythm was a hypnotic, percussive beat that completely detached the money from reality. It wasn't money anymore. It was just a game of egos. 800,000 on the phones. 850. 900. 1 million. A collective murmur rippled through the auction room on the screen. Sharon's hands gripped the edge of her iPad so hard her knuckles turned white. 1,100,000. The bid is against you in the room, sir. At 1,200,000. The bidding war had narrowed down to an aggressive buyer in the front row and a mysterious bidder on the phone in Hong Kong. It was a tennis match of staggering wealth. 1.3, 1.4, 1.5 million. The bid is on the telephone. Silence fell over the room. The auctioneer leaned forward, his gavel raised. Fair warning at $1,500,000. Are we all done? Smack. The gavel hit the wood. Sold for $1.5 million. The screen faded to the Sotheby's logo. Sharon sat in her quiet, dark house, listening to the rain against the roof. $1.5 million. After the auction house fees and taxes, she would net roughly $900,000. It was more money than she had made in her entire 30-year teaching career combined. She slowly opened the banking app on her phone. Her checking account balance stared back at her. $2,412. Beside it, a notification popped up on her screen. It was a text message. For a split second, her heart leaped. Maybe Rebecca had finally called. Maybe she had found the note, felt a pang of guilt, and was reaching out. Sharon opened the message. It wasn't from Rebecca. It was from Brandon. Hey, Mom. I'm really sorry to ask this. I feel like a loser. But my roommate moved out without paying his half, and I'm short on rent this month. Can you spot me $800? I swear I'll pay you back when my gig at the studio pays out. Sharon stared at the text. Brandon. Sweet, non-confrontational, perpetually struggling Brandon. The boy who had stood in that sterile kitchen in Los Angeles and quietly told Scott not to be a jerk, but hadn't had the courage to actually defend her or her gift. She thought about Rebecca's $4 million house and the suffocating arrogance that filled it. Rebecca didn't need a mother. She needed a brand ambassador. Scott didn't respect her. He saw her as a peasant who drove a dusty Subaru. They had literally thrown her love into the garbage. A cold, unfamiliar feeling settled in Sharon's chest. It wasn't just hurt anymore. It was resentment. A quiet, calculated resentment. She looked at Brandon's text again. He was weak, yes. He was an enabler to his sister's toxic behavior, but he had never looked at her with disgust. Sharon typed a reply to Brandon. I'll transfer the $800 right now, but pack a bag and come up to Oregon this weekend. We need to talk. And Brandon, do not tell your sister you're coming. She hit send. The line was drawn. She wasn't just going to help Brandon, she was going to change his life. And she was going to make absolutely certain that Rebecca and Scott never saw a single dime of the Nakamura money. Scott's own world was collapsing in a spectacular slow-motion avalanche of margin calls and past due notices. He was quietly liquidating his luxury watch collection just to keep the landscaping crew paid at the Hidden Hills house. So when Brandon, a guy who had spent the last 5 years dodging calls from debt collectors, suddenly paid off an $80,000 credit card balance and moved into a sleek, cash-bought $400,000 condo in Silver Lake, Scott's radar went off like a siren. It didn't take much to crack Brandon. It just took 3 glasses of Macallan 18 at a dimly lit overpriced speakeasy in West Hollywood. I gotta say, Bran, Scott said smoothly, signaling the bartender for another round. The ice clinked against his crystal tumbler. I'm impressed. I always knew the indie music hustle would pay off eventually, but a cash close on a Silver Lake condo? That's big league. Did you sign a new label deal? Brandon slouched in the leather booth, his cheeks flushed with the heavy, expensive bourbon. He was a lightweight, both in alcohol tolerance and in keeping secrets. Nah, man, he slurred slightly, waving his hand. No label. It was an investment payout. An investment? Scott leaned in, his eyes narrowing, though his smile remained perfectly warm and brotherly. You? I didn't know you had capital in the market. Crypto? Art, Brandon chuckled, a sloppy, unguarded sound. Crazy, right? Remember that ugly mud rock thing Mom brought to Becky's birthday? Scott froze. The thumping bass of the club's sound system seemed to fade out. A cold spike of adrenaline shot straight into his stomach. The sculpture. The one she took back. Yeah, that one. Brandon took a long sip of his drink, oblivious to the sudden, terrifying stillness in his brother-in-law. Turns out it wasn't flea market junk. It was by some dead Japanese-American genius. Sotheby's auctioned it last month in New York. Scott's throat went dry. Sotheby's, how much? Brandon leaned across the table, his breath reeking of liquor, and whispered like a schoolboy sharing a secret. $1.5 million, Scotty. Mom paid off my debts, bought me the condo, set me up with a trust. He sat back, grinning proudly. Just don't tell Becky, okay? Mom made me swear. You know how Becky gets. Scott didn't hear the rest. The walls of the speakeasy seemed to tilt. $1.5 million. He remembered the heavy, cold weight of the ceramic in his hands. He remembered the sound of it hitting the bottom of the hefty trash bag. He had literally thrown a winning lottery ticket into the garbage to make room for empty champagne bottles. And his peasant mother-in-law, the woman driving a rusted Subaru, had quietly picked it out of the trash and walked away with a fortune. Scott's knuckles turned white around his glass. He didn't say another word to Brandon. He just stood up, threw a $100 bill on the table, and walked out into the Los Angeles night. He needed to make a phone call to his lawyer. 2 days later, the rain in Eugene had finally stopped, leaving a heavy, damp chill in the air. Sharon was in her small backyard, pruning her rose bushes. She felt lighter than she had in years. Brandon was secure. Her own retirement was guaranteed. She was finally breathing. The crunch of tires on her gravel driveway broke the silence. Sharon stood up, wiping her dirt-stained hands on her apron. A sleek, rented black Lincoln Navigator sat in her driveway. The doors opened and out stepped Rebecca and Scott. They hadn't called. They hadn't visited Oregon in 5 years. Sharon's stomach tied itself into a cold, tight knot. One look at Rebecca's face, pale, rigid, her designer sunglasses pushed back onto her perfectly blown-out hair, told Sharon everything she needed to know. The secret was out. Rebecca? Scott? What are you doing here? Sharon asked, keeping her distance by the garden gate. Rebecca didn't offer a hug. She marched straight up the concrete path, her heels clicking aggressively. We need to go inside. Now. Sharon led them into the kitchen. The house felt instantly suffocating with their presence. Scott stood by the door, arms crossed, his face a mask of calculated fury. Rebecca slammed her Birkin bag onto the Formica table. How could you? Rebecca's voice trembled, but not with sadness. It was the sharp, piercing vibration of absolute outrage. How could you lie to me like this, your own daughter? I didn't lie to you, Rebecca, Sharon said evenly, refusing to be intimidated in her own home. I just didn't tell you my financial business. Your financial business? Rebecca let out a breathless, mocking laugh. You sold my birthday present for $1.5 million and gave the money to Brandon. You bought him a house while I am drowning in debt, Mom. We are facing foreclosure, and you're playing favorites with a fortune that belonged to me. It didn't belong to you, Sharon's voice hardened. I offered it to you. You rejected it. You both called it flea market junk. Scott threw it in a garbage bag. That is a lie, Rebecca screamed, slamming her hand on the table. The sheer audacity of the denial made Sharon flinch. I was there, Rebecca. I heard you in the garage. I pulled it out of the trash bin myself. I was protecting it from the caterers, Rebecca cried out, tears welling up in her eyes, the perfect weaponized tears of a seasoned manipulator. The kitchen was chaotic. I told Scott to put it in a bag so it wouldn't get scratched, and we put it in the garage to keep it safe until the party was over. And when I woke up, it was gone. You stole it in the middle of the night like a thief. Sharon stared at her daughter, completely, utterly paralyzed by the gaslighting. It was so flawless, so shamelessly fabricated that for a split second, Sharon actually questioned her own sanity. I left you a note, Sharon whispered, her voice shaking with a mixture of grief and pure anger. I left a note on the island. What note? There was no note, Rebecca snapped. You were jealous, Mom. You've always been jealous of the life I built. You saw me succeeding and you couldn't stand it. So you took my $1 million heirloom and gave it to your lazy loser son just to spite me. It wasn't a $1 million heirloom when you threw it away, Sharon fired back, stepping forward. It was dried mud. Those were your exact words, Scott. Don't stand there and pretend you valued it. Scott finally uncrossed his arms. He stepped into the light of the kitchen, his face cold and corporate. He wasn't acting emotional like his wife. He was executing a transaction. What we valued it at is irrelevant, Sharon, Scott said, his voice terrifyingly calm. The law doesn't care about your hurt feelings. The law cares about possession and intent. He reached into his tailored blazer and pulled out a thick, legal-sized manila envelope. He tossed it onto the kitchen table. It landed with a heavy, sickening thud next to Sharon's teacup. What is this? Sharon asked, not making a move to touch it. That is a civil subpoena, Scott said smoothly. We are suing you for conversion of property and breach of fiduciary duty. When you placed that sculpture on our kitchen island and said, I brought your present, Becky, that constituted a completed inter vivos gift under California law. You transferred title. The moment you walked out of that house with it, you committed theft. The room spun. The air in the kitchen felt too thin to breathe. Sharon looked from the manila envelope to the cold, merciless eyes of her son-in-law, and finally to her daughter. Rebecca was dabbing her eyes with a tissue, playing the tragic victim to perfection. I didn't want to do this, Mom, I really didn't. But you forced my hand. We are losing our home. You watched me struggle while you bought Brandon a penthouse. You broke this family, not me. You want to sue your own mother? Sharon whispered. The betrayal ran so deep, it felt like a physical blade scraping against her ribs. For money from a piece of art you despised? I want what is legally mine, Rebecca said, her voice dropping the emotional tremor, revealing the cold steel underneath. My lawyers will be requesting a freeze on your bank accounts by tomorrow morning. If you want to avoid a public, humiliating trial, I suggest you transfer $750,000 into our joint account by Friday. Consider it a settlement. Scott put his hand on his wife's lower back, a gesture of faux protective solidarity. Think carefully, Sharon. You don't have the legal resources to fight us. We'll drain what's left of your auction money just in attorney fees. Do the right thing." They didn't wait for her to answer. They turned and walked out of the kitchen. Sharon stood frozen, listening to the heavy doors of the Lincoln Navigator slam shut. As the SUV backed out of her driveway, she finally reached out with trembling hands and opened the manila envelope. There it was, printed in stark black ink on legal paper. Rebecca Cooper Walker versus Sharon Cooper. Demand for restitution. $1,500,000 US. They weren't just coming for a share. They were coming for all of it. They wanted to destroy her. Sharon sank into her kitchen chair. She looked at the empty space on her counter where she used to clean the sculpture. The silence of the house pressed in on her. For a long time, she just sat there, letting the shock wash over her. Then she looked at her phone. She thought about Brandon, who had sold her out for a few expensive drinks. She thought about Rebecca, who could rewrite history without blinking. She thought about the note she had left on the kitchen island. The note Rebecca claimed never existed. Sharon slowly reached for her phone, opening her photo gallery. She scrolled back to the night of the birthday party. She hadn't just left a note. She was a meticulous, retired schoolteacher. She had taken a time-stamped photograph of the note sitting perfectly centered on Rebecca's pristine marble island, right next to the fruit bowl, before she walked out the door. But that wasn't all. She opened her clouds drive, navigating to a folder she hadn't looked at since that awful night. Inside was a downloaded video file. If they want to play a legal game involving proof of intent, Sharon thought, her grief slowly hardening into something dangerous, then we will play. The mediation took place in a glass-walled conference room on the 32nd floor of a Century City law firm. The air conditioning was turned down to a frigid temperature, an old intimidation tactic meant to make the opposing party uncomfortable. Sharon sat perfectly still at the long mahogany table. She wore a simple charcoal blazer and her silver hair was tied back. Beside her sat David Lynn, a sharp, understated estate litigation attorney she had hired in Portland and flown down for the day. He didn't wear a Rolex. He didn't need to. Across the table sat Rebecca, looking like a grieving widow in a tailored black dress, dabbing at her dry eyes. Next to her was Scott, exuding the smug confidence of a man holding a royal flush. Flanking them was their attorney, Vance Sterling, a man whose smile looked more like a threat. But the person who made Sharon's chest ache, the person who made it hard to draw a full breath, was the fifth person in the room. Brandon. He was sitting at the far end of the table, avoiding eye contact with everyone. He wore a rumpled suit, his leg bouncing nervously under the mahogany wood. He looked sick. "Let's bypass the pleasantries, David," Vance Sterling started, steepling his fingers. "Your client committed a textbook case of conversion. We have a completed inter vivos gift." The moment Mrs. Cooper stated, "I brought your present," and relinquished physical control of the sculpture on my client's kitchen island, title transferred. By returning in the middle of the night and removing it without permission, she essentially burgled my client's property. "A gift requires intent to give and acceptance by the donee," David Lynn replied smoothly, not looking up from his legal pad. "Our position is that your clients explicitly rejected the gift. They called it garbage. They placed it in a trash receptacle. Therefore, the transfer of title was never completed. My client simply retrieved abandoned property." "That is a fabrication," Vance sneered. "My clients moved the piece to the garage to protect it from caterers. They never rejected it. And to prove that, we brought a witness who was present at the time the gift was given." Vance turned to Brandon. "Mr. Cooper, for the record, would you please state what you witnessed regarding the sculpture on the night of your sister's birthday?" Sharon finally looked at her son. "Look at me, Brandon," she thought. "Look at your mother." Brandon swallowed hard. He looked at Scott, who gave him a barely perceptible nod, a cold, silent reminder of whatever leverage he was holding over him. Brandon's voice cracked. He cleared his throat. "I was in the kitchen when Mom gave Becky the present. Becky opened it. She was really happy." Sharon felt a physical pain behind her ribs. "Did she reject it?" Vance prompted. "No," Brandon lied, his eyes fixed firmly on the grain of the mahogany table. "No, she said she loved it. And then, Mom said, 'It's yours now. Forever. No takebacks.'" Rebecca let out a soft theatrical sniffle, nodding along. "And did you hear anyone call it garbage?" or instruct it to be thrown away? Vance pressed. No, Brandon whispered. Becky told Scott to wrap it up carefully and put it in the garage so it wouldn't get broken during the party. That's what I heard. That's what happened. The room fell dead silent. The betrayal was absolute. It wasn't just a lie. It was a calculated assassination of Sharon's character, delivered by the son whose debts she had just paid off, the son she had bought a home for. Scott had clearly gotten to him. Scott had found his weakness and squeezed. "Thank you, Brandon," Vance said, leaning back with a triumphant smirk. He slid a piece of paper across the table toward David Lynn. "As you can see, David, it's 3 against 1. We have a witness corroborating the acceptance of the gift. It's your client's word against the entire family. If we go to a jury trial, Mrs. Cooper will not only lose the full $1.5 million, but she'll be humiliated on public record by her own children. Our settlement offer is open for the next 10 minutes, transferring $1 million to my clients, and we drop the theft charges." Rebecca finally looked at Sharon. Her eyes were hard, devoid of any daughterly affection. "Just sign the paper, Mom. Stop dragging this out. You owe us." Sharon looked at Rebecca. Then she looked at Scott. Finally, she looked at Brandon, who had buried his face in his hands. The sadness that had been weighing Sharon down for weeks suddenly evaporated. It was burned away by a cold, searing clarity. They didn't see her as a mother. They saw her as a bank, an obstacle, a peasant who had stumbled onto a fortune that they believed they inherently deserved. Sharon slowly reached into her purse and pulled out her reading glasses. She slipped them on and turned to her lawyer. "David," she said, her voice completely steady. "I think we're done listening." David Lynn nodded. He closed his legal pad and opened his sleek silver laptop. "Mr. Sterling," David said, his tone shifting from polite to surgical. "Before my client considers your extortionate settlement offer, I'd like to enter 2 pieces of evidence into the mediation record. Exhibit A." David turned the laptop screen toward Vance, Rebecca, and Scott. On the screen was a high-resolution photograph. It showed the pristine marble island of Rebecca's kitchen. Right in the center, next to a bowl of lemons, was a handwritten note on Rebecca's own custom stationery. "This photograph was taken by my client at 1:45 a.m. on the night in question," David explained. "The metadata, which has been independently verified, confirms the exact time and location. The note clearly states my client's reason for taking the sculpture back, specifically that she overheard your clients calling it a hideous lump and discarding it." Rebecca's face paled. She must have faked that. She wrote it, took a picture, and took the note with her." "A creative theory," David said without missing a beat. "Which brings us to Exhibit B." David minimized the photo and opened a video file. "Your clients live in a gated community, Vance. They have a state-of-the-art Ring floodlight cam covering their entire driveway and garage. What they seemingly forgot is that 5 years ago, when they went on vacation to Cabo, they added my client as a shared user on their Ring account so she could check on their dogs. They never revoked her access." Scott's arrogant smirk vanished instantly. The color drained from his face so fast he looked physically ill. "When motion was detected in the garage at 1:15 a.m., my client received an automatic notification on her phone," David continued, his voice echoing in the quiet room. "She downloaded the clip to the cloud immediately. The audio is crystal clear." David pressed play. The laptop speakers crackled to life. On the screen, the garage door was open. Scott and Rebecca stood next to the trash bins. It wasn't Sharon's memory anymore. It was an undeniable digital reality. "What was your mother thinking?" Scott's voice rang out from the computer, venomous and clear. "Bringing an actual piece of garbage to the house. The thing ruins the entire aesthetic of the living room. It looks like dried mud." Brandon's head snapped up from his hands. He stared at the screen, horrified. "She's delusional, Scott. She's always been delusional," Rebecca's voice followed, dripping with disgust. "She lives in this fantasy world where thrift store junk has spiritual meaning. Just get it out of my sight. God, I need a Xanax." Then came the visual. Clear as day in the infrared night vision footage, Scott shoved the heavy, jagged ceramic sculpture into a black plastic hefty bag and tossed it violently onto a pile of trash. David paused the video. The silence in the conference room was absolute, heavy, and suffocating. Vance Sterling, the aggressive bulldog attorney, was staring at his clients with a look of profound, furious realization. He had been lied to. His entire case was built on a foundation of easily disprovable perjury. As you can see, Vance, David said quietly, not only was the gift explicitly rejected and discarded like literal trash, but your clients just coerced a witness into committing perjury in front of an attorney. If this goes to a judge, I won't just win the civil case. I will file for sanctions against your firm, and I will hand this recording over to the district attorney for witness tampering and perjury. Scott, Rebecca whispered, her hands shaking uncontrollably as she looked at her husband. You said there were no cameras inside the garage. Shut up, Rebecca, Scott hissed, his corporate mask completely shattered, revealing the desperate, cornered animal underneath. Oh, the video isn't finished, David said, his finger hovering over the trackpad. Because after Rebecca went inside to take her Xanax, Scott stayed in the garage to make a phone call. David pressed play again. On the screen, Scott pulled out his phone, pacing the driveway. Marcus, it's me, the digital Scott said, his voice frantic. I don't care what the penalty is. We need to push the closing date. If the bank runs another credit sweep right now, we are dead in the water. I just took out a second mortgage on the Hidden Hills house using Rebecca's forged signature. If she finds out before the Henderson Commission clears, I'm going to jail. Just stall them. David closed the laptop with a sharp snap. The sound was like a gunshot in the freezing room. Rebecca stopped breathing. She turned to Scott, her perfectly manicured facade cracking into a million pieces. A second mortgage? She choked out, her voice barely a whisper. You forged my signature? Scott, what did you do? Scott didn't look at her. He was staring at the table, his chest heaving, his hands gripping the arms of his chair so tightly they were trembling. He had tried to steal $1 million from his mother-in-law to cover his own criminal fraud, and he had just been exposed on tape. Brandon looked like he was going to vomit. He looked at Sharon, his eyes wide with a mixture of terror and overwhelming shame. Mom, I didn't know. He told me if I didn't back them up, he'd report me to the IRS for the cash gigs I took last year. He blackmailed me, Mom. I'm so sorry. Sharon looked at her son. She felt pity, yes, but the trust was gone. Forever. She stood up. She buttoned her simple charcoal blazer, looking down at the wreckage of her family. You called my art flea market junk, Sharon said, her voice echoing with the quiet, unshakable authority of a teacher who had finally dismissed the class. You called me delusional. You threatened to ruin me and drain my accounts. And you made my son lie under oath. She looked directly at Vance Sterling, who was already aggressively packing his briefcase, wanting nothing to do with a client who had just confessed to mortgage fraud on tape. We are not settling, Sharon stated. You are dropping this lawsuit immediately, with prejudice. Furthermore, my lawyer will be drafting an agreement stating that neither Rebecca, Scott, nor Brandon will ever attempt to contact me or make any claim to my estate again. If you refuse to sign it, David releases the tape to the DA. Rebecca burst into tears, real ugly, terrified tears this time. Mom, please, he ruined me. Scott ruined me. You can't just leave me. I'm going to lose the house. I'll be homeless. Sharon looked at her daughter. She saw the panic. She saw the desperation. But she didn't see an ounce of regret for the way she had treated her mother. She only saw regret for getting caught. You built your life on appearances, Rebecca, Sharon said softly. It's time to see what's left when the paint peels off. Sharon turned and walked out of the glass-walled conference room, her heels clicking steadily on the hardwood floor. David Lynn followed close behind. She didn't look back. For the first time in 35 years, she didn't feel the need to fix her children's mistakes. She was finally free. Chào bạn, chúng ta đã đi đến chặng đường cuối cùng của câu chuyện. Phần 5, Act 5 sẽ là một bản nhạc buồn, nhưng tuyệt đẹp về sự chữa lành và những ranh giới cần thiết trong tình cảm gia đình. Nhịp độ ở phần này sẽ chậm lại hẳn. Không còn những cuộc tranh cãi nảy lửa hay những màn đấu trí pháp lý. Thay vào đó là sự tĩnh lặng của hậu quả, sự thức tỉnh muôn màng và một cái kết rất đời tại nước Ý. Dưới đây là kịch bản chi tiết cho Act 5. Act 5. The Terracotta Boundary and the Tuscan Sun. The collapse of Rebecca and Scott's curated life did not happen overnight. It was a slow, agonizing bleed, played out over 6 brutal months. Vance Sterling, true to his self-preserving nature as a high-powered attorney, had immediately withdrawn his representation the moment the mediation ended. He didn't just drop them as clients, He made a quiet phone call to the state ethics board to cover his own tracks regarding the perjury. Without Sterling's protection, the dominoes fell with terrifying speed. The bank discovered Scott's forged signature on the second mortgage. The fraud triggered an immediate default. The $4 million pristine white modern farmhouse in Hidden Hills was foreclosed on in less than 90 days. The sleek black Range Rovers were quietly repossessed in the middle of the night. Scott, facing federal wire fraud and forgery charges, took a plea deal that stripped him of his financial consulting license permanently and handed him a 3-year sentence in a minimum security facility. Rebecca filed for divorce the day he was indicted. But the damage was done. Her reputation in the luxury real estate market, a world built entirely on appearances, trust, and flawless aesthetics, was incinerated. Her wealthy clients vanished, fleeing the stench of bankruptcy and scandal like a plague. As for Brandon, he kept the Silver Lake condo. Legally, Sharon couldn't take it back, and she didn't want to, but the condo became a tomb. He tried calling his mother dozens of times, leaving agonizing, tearful voicemails begging for forgiveness. Sharon never answered. She didn't block his number, but she never picked up. He had chosen his fear over her, and that was a bridge that couldn't be rebuilt with a simple apology. He had a paid-off house, but he had lost his family. Sharon saw Rebecca one last time before she left the country. They met at a nondescript faded diner off the I-5 freeway, halfway between Los Angeles and Oregon. It was neutral ground. Smelling of burnt filter coffee and old frying oil, it was the exact kind of place the old Rebecca would have refused to step foot in. When Rebecca walked through the glass door, the physical transformation was jarring. The silk slip dresses and the flawless blowout were gone. She wore an oversized, faded university sweatshirt and plain jeans. Her hair was pulled back into a messy, unstyled knot. The perfectly manicured nails were chipped. But it was her eyes that struck Sharon the most. They were hollow, exhausted, stripped entirely of the arrogant, hyper-focused energy that used to define her. She looked like a woman who had spent 6 months running from a tidal wave, only to realize she was already underwater. Rebecca slid into the vinyl booth across from her mother. She didn't order anything. She just wrapped her hands around the cheap paper napkin on the table, tearing it into tiny strips. "Hi, Mom," she whispered. Her voice was raspy, broken. "Hello, Rebecca," Sharon said. Her tone wasn't cold, but it wasn't warm either. It was the calm, steady voice of a survivor. "I moved the girls into a 2-bedroom apartment in Encino," Rebecca said, staring at the torn napkin. "I got a job working the front desk at a dental clinic. It barely covers the rent. The legal fees from the divorce. They wiped out whatever was left of my savings." Sharon took a slow sip of her black tea. She didn't offer a lifeline. She didn't offer a platitude. She just listened. "I'm sorry," Rebecca choked out, the tears finally spilling over her eyelashes, cutting tracks through her makeup-free face. "I am so sorry, Mom. For the lawsuit, for the lies, for what I let Scott do. I was so blinded by the image. I was so terrified of looking poor that I became a monster to the only person who actually loved me." "You didn't just let Scott do it, Rebecca," Sharon said gently, but the words carried the weight of a judge's gavel. "You participated. You stood in my kitchen and looked me in the eye and told me I was a jealous, delusional thief. You used my love for you as a weapon." Rebecca squeezed her eyes shut, a sob catching in her throat. I know. I don't expect you to forgive me. I don't know how I'm going to pay for the girls' school next semester. I'm drowning, Mom." There it was, the inevitable ask. Beneath the genuine tears and the crushing realization of her mistakes, the desperate need for financial rescue still lingered. Sharon reached into her leather tote bag. She didn't pull out a checkbook. Instead, she pulled out a thick, legal-bound folder with a navy blue cover and slid it across the sticky laminate table. Rebecca looked at it, confused. "What is this?" "It's an irrevocable educational trust," Sharon explained, her voice steady and clear. "I have placed $600,000 into it. The sole beneficiaries are your 2 daughters. The funds can only be accessed to pay directly for their tuition, books, and educational living expenses until they turn 25. Rebecca's breath caught. She reached out, her trembling fingers tracing the embossed lettering on the folder. "Mom, $600,000? This covers everything. College? Grad school? Everything. Yes, Sharon nodded. But there are ironclad stipulations. You are not the trustee. David Lynn's firm is. You cannot access a single penny of this money to pay off your credit cards, your rent, or your legal debts. And neither can Scott. This money skips a generation. Rebecca looked up, her face a complex map of immense relief and quiet devastation. The realization hit her. Her mother was saving her children, but she was refusing to save her. "You're cutting me off," Rebecca whispered. "I am setting a boundary," Sharon corrected gently. "I paid off Brandon's debts, and it cost me his integrity. I am not going to pay off yours and rob you of the chance to actually rebuild your own character. You built a life on an illusion, Rebecca. Now you have to build a real one. From scratch. Bricks and mortar." Rebecca looked at the trust document, then back at her mother. For the first time in her adult life, she didn't argue. She didn't manipulate. She just nodded, tears falling silently onto the table. "Where are you going?" Rebecca asked, noticing the packed duffel bag in the back of Sharon's Subaru through the diner window. "Italy," Sharon smiled, a small, genuine expression that reached her eyes. "A little village in Tuscany. I've rented an old stone farmhouse for the next 3 years. It has a kiln." Rebecca wiped her face with the back of her sleeve. Will you ever come back?" "I don't know," Sharon said honestly. She stood up, leaving a $10 bill on the table for the tea. She didn't lean in for a hug. The physical distance between them felt necessary, like a cast on a broken bone. "Take care of the girls, Rebecca. Take care of yourself." Sharon walked out of the diner, the bell above the door chiming lightly in the afternoon air. A year later, the Tuscan sun was a thick golden syrup that poured over the rolling hills of Valdorcia. Sharon Cooper sat on the terracotta patio of her farmhouse, her hands coated in a fine layer of gray, wet clay. The air smelled of wild rosemary and baking bread. There were no ring cameras here, no sleek black SUVs, just the endless, quiet rhythm of the olive trees swaying in the wind. She was working on a new sculpture. It wasn't as complex as a Yuki Nakamura, but it was hers. It was raw, asymmetrical, and entirely free from the burden of needing to be perfect. Her phone buzzed on the rustic wooden table beside her. It was a rare sound. Sharon wiped her hands on a damp towel and picked up the device. It was a text message from Rebecca. It wasn't a plea for money. It wasn't a complaint about her difficult life. It was a photograph. The picture showed the bare, slightly scuffed wall of Rebecca's small apartment in Encino. Taped to the center of the wall was a finger painting done by her youngest daughter. It was a chaotic, vibrant explosion of blue and yellow paint, messy and entirely uncurated. Beneath the photo was a short text message. "We went to a free community art class today. Maya made this. It doesn't match the furniture, and the colors are a complete mess. I think it's the most beautiful thing I've ever seen. I miss you, Mom." Sharon sat in the quiet Italian sun, looking at the bright, messy finger painting on the screen. She thought about the heavy ceramic sculpture sitting in a glass case somewhere in a billionaire's penthouse, and she thought about the piece of paper taped to a cheap apartment wall. She didn't call Rebecca immediately. Healing a wound that deep couldn't be rushed. It needed air. It needed time to scar over. But for the first time in a very long time, the heavy weight in Sharon's chest lifted entirely. She tapped the screen, leaving the message on read. Then she slowly typed 2 words. "It is." She hit send, put the phone face down on the table, and went back to the clay. The earth felt cool and forgiving beneath her fingers, ready to be shaped into something new.